Hi everyone, I'm Hayley Kolding and I work with Vermont River Conservancy as the Southern Vermont Conservation Manager. VRC is a nonprofit that works throughout the state. Our official mission is to protect and restore rivers for people and wildlife. And if that sounds like a slight off-topic tangent from the plant talk, I updated our mission, and it's actually to protect and restore rivers for people and wildlife and plants. And in fact, to protect and restore rivers for people and wildlife with plants. Because, as Kelly said, plants are one of the really important parts of these natural processes that make our rivers healthy. That's for clean water, it's for flood resilience, it's for having a place where you can go and unwind when the world is stressful. There's just so many ways that plants do that important work in our landscape. And at VRC, the way that we work with and for plants and people and the whole natural community is often through conservation easements, through acquiring land, like helping partners acquire land, through doing on-the-ground restoration, and then from doing community outreach. Native plants are really, really crucial to a healthy river. When I think of the parts of that river system where plants are doing great work, one part is the buffer that runs along either side of the river channel. So the buffer is that strip of vegetation that's not mowed down within an inch of its life, but it's actually the trees and the shrubs and the grasses and sedges and everything natural that's filling in that space along the river, so that it's absorbing some of the energy when the river floods. It's absorbing sediments and gravel. It's providing wildlife habitat. It's shading the river so that it's cool even on a really hot day, maybe for us, but maybe for the fish that we depend on. In the floodplain, the plants are so important for helping to absorb more water, and again, to absorb more energy and sediments. They're great habitat. And throughout the entirety of the riverland, it just becomes a more beautiful place to be when you have native plants. So what I'm going to do is zoom through a few of the natural communities in Vermont that exist in our river systems, starting in some upper watershed areas, moving down to our valleys. I'll talk a little bit about the plants that live there, but really I'm going to focus on the work that they do. And you'll see, I actually don't want you to focus too much on that bar at the bottom because it's going to be really repetitive. And the reason it's really repetitive is because it just keeps being true that plants are useful. Like over and over, they're doing great work. So the text at the bottom is not going to change much, but the pictures are, and they're really beautiful. So I just invite you to focus on all of the different ways that plants are creating beauty and creating function in our river systems. We'll start out in the deep broadleaf marsh. This is an environment in Marlborough, Vermont, at the headwaters of the Green River, that was created by the majestic work of the American beaver. This is a nice deep water environment up in the headwaters where, because we have a slowdown and a damming effect from the beavers, the water is able to really spread, settle out its sediments, purify the water. There's a lot of room for groundwater recharge. So really important for making sure that we're resistant to both flooding and drought. And then we have some really beautiful, amazing plants like the American bur reed or water shield or some of these other lovely leaves that are kind of sprinkled across this oasis. It's an amazing place to go birding, to watch the beavers frolicking, and it really protects everything downstream. A shallow emergent marsh is similar. It's not as deep water, and we might get more grasses and sedges. Here's the soft-stemmed rush. But again, this is a place where you have really lovely connectivity between the river and the groundwater. This is a place where things move slowly, and when they move slowly, they have time to filter out those sediments and to keep our water clean and cool. Oops. This is a less common community, but it's so cool that I wanted to throw it in. Also up in the headwaters, we have some red spruce cinnamon fern swamps. In this swamp, you'll see kind of an open canopy with nice spruce trees, spaced out, getting a lot of sun, this like sort of wet carpet of cinnamon ferns and mossy hummocks and hollows. It feels really quiet, like you're kind of in this like bowl under the sky, really restful place. And this is a place that is a more specialized habitat, but functionally it's doing something similar to the last two places I showed you. Again, it's this like connection between the groundwater and the river. It's a connection between the animals that live there, in the swamps, in the plants, and in the river itself. I think most of you are here because of plants. Did anyone come here because of flood concerns? Kind of, yeah, a couple people. Okay, so this I think is where the action starts getting like much easier to understand. Thinking about what's the benefit of a beaver pond way up in the headwaters to flooding. That's still, even though it's there and even though it's scientifically proven, it's a little harder to see that in action. But when you get down into the lower parts of the river, where you see these amazing thickets of alders and willows and dogwoods that are lining the banks, and you've driven through parts of town where there's nothing like that lining the banks, and you've seen these like really bare, sandy, slumping, chaotic scenes of erosion, this is a place where you can be like, oh yeah, I think those plants are actually doing something really important right now. They're absorbing a lot of energy when the water comes up over the banks, and they're providing natural stability. Natural stability is different than riprap. Natural stability is dynamic. It's a habitat, it's a place of life. It's something that is going to change and move over time, but it's going to change and move in a way that's like more in balance with the natural systems. So we don't want stability in the sense of permanent, unyielding, cross your fingers and hope the flood doesn't get too big. We want stability like this, that's like living and breathing with the river. That wild cucumber blows my mind. The alder swamp is another habitat similar to the alluvial shrub swamp that I showed you before. Again, really important for natural stability in our rivers. Got some red orchard dogwood thrown in, got some pussy willow, and of course the speckled alder. What about a cattail marsh? What about the best place to see a red-winged blackbird singing or nesting? What about a nice place for the water to slow down and spread out some of those sediments again? Has anyone here paddled in a place like this? Grace has, yeah. Yeah, as well. This feels like going through a cathedral. These silver maples that are spreading out over the river and shading it, that have these like really big, airy, kind of blousy canopies and this like really amazing arch to their trunk. In the understory of this forest, we have this really wonderful phenomenon where as the water, or as the river floods it year after year, it's depositing new layers of sediments. So there's this continual richness and refreshment. And I'd so much rather see that making a really rich understory for a forest, growing beautiful wood nettle, maybe some spotted touch-me-not or some other beautiful ferns, rather than just showing up in the middle of a field or a road or downtown. Similar story for the silver maple sensitive fern floodplain forest. Now I threw in the erosional bluff, partly because the plants are cool, like this nodding beggar stick, but partly because not every single place, not every single natural community in a river needs to reduce flooding for it to be natural, because a river is a dynamic system. And it's actually meant to erode in places over time, and it's meant to move, and it's meant to be dynamic and changing and fluid as it moves through time, through history. So there are places in our rivers where we see erosion happening on the outside of a river bench normally, like the outside of that S-curve. And that's natural, and there's plants that are really well adapted to that. It's a nice full sun environment. It's a place where there's a lot of disturbance, so maybe there are certain plants that are like better adapted for that particular competitive environment. And it's okay to see erosion. What we don't want to see is like the erosion that's caused because we've completely deforested our river system. But this is a beautiful example of what it can look like in its like natural state. This picture, I'm trying to remember if I took that on my land. I think I did. But the river cobble shore is my favorite place to see spotted sandpiper hopping around in its breeding season. It's a great place to see, Grace, what do you call this? Apicitum, cannabidum? What's it called? Hemp dogvane, blue vervain, some nice virgin's bower. I can't actually tell which plant this is on that size. But there's something so lovely, right, about having this field of boulders or cobble, and then suddenly these like lush explosions of plant life. And they're doing some stabilizing for us for sure. They're like over time, something that looks bare is becoming colonized by plants. Sometimes the slower moving environments are going to give us sands or mud instead of cobble, but somewhat similar plant communities. Here's some ditch stonecrop. In the mud, where you might see some raccoon tracks pressed into that bare, muddy substrate, you can also find the straw-colored flat sedge, Pennsylvania bittercress, some rushes, some sedges. Again, a very dynamic part of the river, or maybe the flood levels are only exposing it and allowing the seeds to germinate a little bit later in the season, when the summer's flows have finally calmed down. It's a place of surprises in our plant community. I think Grace will tell you more about this place, the calcareous riverside seep, where you can find the beauty of Calms lobelia and grass of Parnassus. River shore grasslands, similar functions of stability, similar ability to maintain sediment storage, but also a great place to see color in the spring and summer, with amazing geopieweeds and milkweeds and fringed loosestrife. It's just a good, to me it feels like a place of recharge. And I'm going to end here on the sedge meadow, just maybe have a quiet moment together and just look at this picture. How beautiful are those clumps and tufts of sedges, absorbing the water, connected. Grace is going to talk to you more about understanding this balance we have between the rare plants, which we really want to preserve and protect, and the common plants, which are part of the ethos of where we live. They're a part of our functional river systems. They keep our water clean. They provide habitat for different animals. They prevent flooding from being as destructive as it has been in our recent memory. And so much of these common plants can come and they can help us in places where we haven't allowed them to thrive. So I'm going to close with this story. In downtown Brattleboro, there's this 12-acre parcel that was used as a lumber staging ground. Tons and tons of gravel fill was brought in. It used to be a floodplain. They just filled it right up until the land was actually higher than the river, so it couldn't flood anymore. The upstream downtown looked pretty dismal. It was behind a locked gate. Some people still walked in and swam there, but it wasn't a super welcoming place. So what we did was we took out these hundreds of thousands of cubic yards of fill, and we planted a bunch of native plants. And I want to say, and we waited to see what happened. We had to guess what would happen. We had actually a very informed prediction of what would happen. And what happened was that when we took this bare place and we replanted some of our beautiful native grasses and sedges and rushes and trees and shrubs and flowers, this reduces flood elevation locally by 1 to 2 feet. And in the downtown area, it's also reducing flood risk to homes and to businesses. It's been so fun to go out there with kids from the local elementary school and have them exploring this place, making their nature observations. It's not just a grassy field, it's a beautiful blooming playground for them, but it's a place that's keeping us safer too, and plants are so much of the magic of that. So thank goodness for plants. I'll pass the mic to Grace, who is the queen of plants in Vermont, and she'll share a lot more with you.
I want to thank Kelly especially. This event was born out of a question that Kelly emailed me a couple of months ago. And essentially Kelly was asking, we have all these native plants, we want to plant some. How do I choose? We have over 1,800 species of native plants in Vermont. What is the responsible and also the most ecologically meaningful way to choose from all of those? I'm going to try to answer that question in this talk and leave you with some tools that you can take with you in the coming growing season to grow native plants. But I'm going to start with a rarity, sticking to our river theme. I'm going to introduce you to one of our rarest river shore plants in Vermont. My work with the Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department is focused on rare, threatened, and endangered species. So I work for the Vermont Natural Heritage Inventory work program within the department. I think a lot of people don't realize that the department works on more than deer. We do. We spend a lot of time thinking about our rare plants. Where are they? How are they doing? And what do we do? What conservation action do we take? Okay, so our rare river shore plant here is cut-leaved windflower, or Anemone multifida. We have only one population of this plant in the state. This is really a more northern species reaching the southern edge of its range here. In fruit, it has these little globes of furry seed heads and these highly dissected leaves. And this is a plant that is really loyal to limestone outcrops on the edge of large rivers. So really like gorges where the water rushes through and the plants are misted by this fine mist. It kind of creates this really particular microhabitat that's cool and misty. We did have 4 sites for this species in Vermont at one time. We now have only one population remaining. More on that in a moment. This is a really showy native plant. The flowers range from white to pink to purplish. And there's that fluffy seed head again. So when we think about our really rare plants at the Heritage Inventory, one of our first questions that we ask is, why is this plant rare? What is the underlying reason for rarity? Because we can't really make decisions about what actions to take if we don't know what the underlying causes are. So for this plant, and here's this great limestone outcrop habitat. This is our last remaining site here. You can see it's not that vegetated because it's scoured by floods, and that's that natural disturbance process. And a lot of our river shore ledge species like that open condition. There are little cracks of soil, not very much, but in these cracks, that's where this plant thrives. So why is anemone rare? The English name is cut-leaved windflower, but we'll just call it an anemone here. As you probably gathered, this is a habitat specialist. So really particular site, and these sites are just rare on the landscape. So you have this species that's probably always been rare. However, there are other factors at play here. When we started damming our rivers, we lost our other 3 sites because the hydrologic regime changed at these sites. They weren't being scoured in the way that this plant was adapted to. The mist changed, so they started to dry out. Maybe we don't know exactly what changed, but the loss of the landscape process and just the habitat caused us to lose these 3 other sites. This is our remaining site with the dam there. And this is Matt Peters, who's an excellent botanist who's been doing a lot of the monitoring of this population over time. And then lastly, for this species, I think climate change is a big factor, particularly drought. What we've noticed over time as we monitor this population is that here's the 80s. We have really good data over time on this, thanks to Jerry Jenkins, who started monitoring this in the 80s. We had over 500 plants in the 80s, but then these orange bars are droughty summers, and you see this decline at each of the drought years. Again, these little dips at each of the drought years. There's a little bit of recovery after those drought years in this population, but we call this a stair-step decline because you don't really get full recovery of the species, and over time you just get the steady decline. Okay, so we saw this happening and we said, let's try to do something about this. What did we do? Well, we started going out when the plants were in fruit, and we would take the seeds and by hand we would put them in these cracks that we thought were suitable right at that site. And then we would monitor to see if seedlings came up. These are the tiny little seedlings that we count every year. This, we continue to see seedlings come up, but there weren't like a ton of plants coming out of this seeding effort. It's probably not like really worthwhile. So then we called up Native Plant Trust. Luckily, we had seeds from this very population in Native Plant Trust's long-term storage seed vaults. And this is a really important kind of genetic backup, because we can't just take seeds from somewhere else from Canada or something where they're more common, because the genetics are likely completely different. These plants are locally adapted to these conditions. So we took those seeds, we called them up, we said, we really want to augment this population, it's not doing well, can you grow out some plants for us? They did that, and we planted them out on site and carefully marked them all so we could monitor how they did. We had a little bit of trouble because the cracks in the ledge are so small. Imagine trying to get a plant in there, and then what happens is they can't really root the way they would if they were growing naturally. So in 2023, when we had the large flood, some of those plants were swept away, and there were just holes in their place. Some of them lived and sprouted back after the flood, but it wasn't really enough to bring us back to those numbers that we once had. Okay, so is anybody feeling sad? Yeah. Yes. And that's okay. I am too. But I'm telling you the story for a reason, and it's because we're going to take this hard truth and do something with it and move forward. And before I get there, I want to tell you a story that's a little more optimistic. This is another one of our very rare plants in Vermont, roseroot. It's a succulent that grows on high, dripping, really inaccessible cliffs, boreal calcareous cliffs. So why is this species rare? It's another habitat specialist. We have two populations, and those are the only populations we've ever known of. You know, in recent history at least, it seems like they've been at those two spots, and they're really holding steady. In fact, one of the populations that was found in 1970, or first documented in 1970, is actually bigger now than it was then. So this is great. These are large reproducing populations, and they're both on conserved land. So what do we take from these two stories? Well, if we want to protect rare plants in Vermont, we need to step back and protect them where they are first. And it's not too late for a lot of species. We can't go back and prevent those dams from being built at the former anemone sites. But there's a lot that we can do to conserve the stage for these plants to live out their lives. And a lot of our rare plants are much more resilient than I think we give them credit for. This is a boreal species that is doing great. Of course, we don't know how climate change will impact some of these populations in the future, and I don't mean to oversimplify by saying that, you know, buying parcels and putting them in conservation is going to solve all our problems. But we also, I think, need to acknowledge the resiliency of these populations when we give them a large buffer and conserve their habitat. So conserving a boreal calcareous cliff, that is really palatable, because that is an undevelopable site. What about a developable site that is experiencing a lot of pressure, like sand plains? In Vermont, after the last glacier retreated, we had this huge deposit of sand in the Burlington area, and we're left with these well-drained, flat sand plains that became pitch pine sand plain forests with these beautiful openings of lowbush blueberry, little pitch pines coming up, and wood lily, which is a state uncommon species that likes these droughty soils. We have lost over 90% of our sandplain forest in Vermont. That is a huge number, and I'll show you a map of one of our sandplains to just illustrate what rare plant hotspots these places are. So all of our, this is in Colchester, nice sandplain. All of these green polygons are rare plants, and you can see from this mess of species names, they're all different species here. The orange polygons are uncommon species, and the purple is that state significant sandplain forest that's mapped by our ecologists. So this is also a site that is burned periodically, so that landscape process still persists there. This is probably our largest tract of sandplain forest in Vermont. Just incredible hotspots for rare species. This is what that pitch pine forest looked like. And just imagine, I mean, it's hard to imagine the extent of what this natural community would have been before we lost over 90% of it. So when we talk about habitat conservation, it's absolutely crucial that we put the pressure on to conserve the last remnants of these places that are really fragmented and under development pressure. And it's not just sand plains, it's floodplains, it's clay plains as well, but this is a particularly dramatic example. So, imagine yourself in the pitch pine forest. What is the foundation of that pitch pine forest? It's not rare plants, though there are a lot of rare plants scattered here and there. A lot of them are annuals and fire adapted, so they're moving around this stage. They're sprinkled in, but the real basis, the real foundation of this ecosystem is common native species. The stands of huckleberry in the understory, the lawns of sedges that come in after the fire, the pitch pine, the blue stem that's hosting particular pollinator species. So why am I telling you this about common species? Well, it's going to be difficult to restore the anemone. Even just that one population that we have, getting it back to the place where it was, to be frank, it might not be possible. We're going to try our hardest at the Heritage Inventory, that's our job. But, and you know, that's no matter how many plants we put out, it's just going to be, there's no easy answer, and that's the complexity of rare species conservation. But I think that all of us in this room have the real potential to restore some of that abundance of these common species to the landscape. And I don't think that we should undervalue the impact that that could have on biodiversity in Vermont. And also on our local wildlife and on climate resiliency, because we need to ask, are the common species staying common? You know, we spend a lot of time working to protect rare species, and we need to, they need that. But we also need to check in with our common species and make sure that they're not declining, because we know from the habitat loss that, yes, they're common, but they used to be a lot more common. So how can we put some of them back? And I see a lot of energy in the plant native movement. I just see an increasing interest in native species and planting pollinator gardens, and that's really exciting to see. And I think that a focus on how can we align that with ecological goals, with conservation goals, could really funnel that energy in a way that's more ecologically meaningful, and kind of make a shift, to take all that growing momentum and use it to our best ability to get the most meaningful outcomes for wildlife and habitat. and just the common species themselves to increase them. And you know, that's what we mean by restoring abundance. Okay, so this shift that I'm talking about, what does that look like? A good place to start would be to make sure that we are putting pressure on seed companies and nurseries to actually sell native plants. So has anybody bought a plant mix that's called like native wildflower, like, yeah. Here's a mix from American Meadows that's called Northeast Wildflower, something along the lines of Northeast Wildflower mix. None of these species are native to New England, not even Vermont. Needless to say, a meadow of this in your backyard is going to be much less valuable to wildlife than if you actually use native species. Okay, so how do we look at these lists and figure out if they're actually native species or not? I'll tell you how. This is a great website called Go Botany. You can find it by just Googling Go Botany New England. Just covers New England, but we're really lucky to have it because it shows you the range of any species, and you can type in the English name or the Latin name. If you're getting purple here in your range map, that means non-native. And what this is showing for this turtlehead is that in the purple counties, this species has been documented escaping from gardens. And escaping from gardens is the biggest way that we introduce non-native invasive species into the landscape. So really important to avoid these. This is actually outdated, and last year we documented this species escaping into a natural area in Vermont. This was in my yard when I bought my house, so it's commonly cultivated. And Hayley showed us this one. Why grow that species when you could grow the beautiful native lookalike that is maybe slightly less showy, but I don't really think so. It's a really showy plant. This green range map, that means all native. And then you'll want to scroll down to the bottom of each page, and then you can see whether a species is common in your state. So good to go in this one, white turtlehead. We don't see any listings under conservation status. So I'll show you what it looks like if you, in a moment, if you have a rare species. First though, so now you have native plants that you know are actually native. What about sourcing the seed? This is kind of a separate issue because you could go down the street to a nursery in Vermont and buy a plant. That doesn't mean that the seed was actually collected from Vermont, and this is what we call the provenance, or where was the seed actually taken from the fruiting head. A lot of seed comes from the Midwest, and then it's grown out and propagated in greenhouses here and sold. That's just a common way that propagation is done. If eco-regional plants are important to you, then you're going to want to ask, what is the provenance of the seed? Wild Seed Project in Maine is an example of a company that says on their website, all of our seed is local provenance. It's from Maine, from somewhere in Maine. In my yard, I've grown a lot of things from Wild Seed Project because I tend just not to be super hyper-local. I think there are a lot of different definitions of ecoregion, and it kind of depends on what you value. A lot of people think of New England as within one ecoregion. So it's a great option. As I'm sure all of you know, it's hard to find actual local ecotype seeds, so you kind of have to take what you can get sometimes. But Wild Seed Project has local ecotype common species. It's great. And some studies have shown that local ecotype seed provides more value to wildlife. There might be different flowering times for a Midwest ecotype, or like slightly different flower shape or something like that. And then of course our local ecotypes are more adapted to where we are, and we care about that as we want to support plants adapting to climate change. Lastly, keep it common. We've kind of been hinting at this all morning, but we want to avoid locally rare species. This is what it will look like if you come across on Go Botany a species that is regionally rare. This is protected by law in a lot of New England states, probably one that you want to avoid. There are a lot of reasons for this. One is genetic. When you buy seed of a locally rare species, it often comes from somewhere else. This would probably be the Midwest. A lot of things come from the Midwest. And those are often genetically distinct. What happens when you grow that seed out here is that you risk your plants breeding, crossbreeding with natural populations. This is particularly true with restoration projects or big populations that people are starting in natural areas. But what happens when you get that inbreeding is that you have the genetic contamination of our last populations with non-local genetics, and that is irreversible. We don't really understand all of the implications of that, but we know that it could cause our populations to become maladapted in the face of climate change. And so think of the anemone, that's really like the last thing that population needs. I'll just say, we have a lot of rare species. At the Heritage Inventory, we track over 500 rare and uncommon species. It's a lot to keep track of, and I do feel like it's kind of a big ask a lot of times when I'm asking people to do this. But unfortunately, right now it's on us to do that legwork and then put the pressure on nurseries, because there's just not the ethic on the nursery end. Mm-hmm. And part of why I wanted to talk to you about this is because it takes all of us to start to create that collective ethic and like move this movement in a way that wherever we think is like most meaningful. I'll say one more thing about this growing rare species issue, which is that if your plant is rare everywhere, and we do have some globally rare species in Vermont, and you see people advertising ethically sourced local ecotype seed, that is not ethically sourced, because seed collected from a globally rare species is not ethically sourced. Maybe one person thinks that they're doing this ethically, but imagine if 20 people say, oh, I'll go out to this population and collect seed ethically. Suddenly you have seed collection that is not so responsible, especially because a lot of our rare plants don't produce a lot of seed. They're not very good at reproducing, a lot of them. So we don't want to be putting that seed collection pressure on our regionally rare plants. This is counterintuitive to a lot of people, so we're really trying to ramp up the educational effort on this. Okay, I'm going to wrap up and open the floor for questions, but first I just want to tie together the kind of two separate things that I've been talking about today. First, we started with rarities, and this was not a typo. It wasn't supposed to be like conserving rarities on the landscape. It's actually getting at this point that some of our rare species are just rare, and it's okay. We don't necessarily want to make everything more common, put it out everywhere. But we do want to protect habitat. We do want to monitor these populations and make sure that they're persisting. That brings us to the second point, that if we want to plant native species in a really impactful way, the most impactful way that we can for biodiversity and wildlife, we can be choosy. We can choose common species that have been lost in part from the landscape, that we still see as common, but they're not as abundant. We can restore some of that abundance to the landscape. And really focus that energy to make a difference. And I think that's exciting, just to see kind of the growing momentum there. So I will leave you with a list of a few of my favorite common native species that are actually available. It's always hard to like, you may have a native species that you're really fond of and it's just not available anywhere. So I'll leave that up if you want to take a picture. And open the floor for questions.
Grace, will you guys be able to share your slides as well?
Sure.
Or have you some of them?
Definitely.
I'm going to throw out the first question. While you were talking, I hopped on Go Botany and I looked up the scarlet bee balm, and that one's, even though bee balm is showing as a common native species, the particular species of the purple of the scarlet, not the scarlet, but the fuchsia that I've got, that's showing up as purple. Don't plant this. So I'm sending people home with seeds today.
Well,
so no.
that one is a little bit contentious, or there's some, we don't exactly know what the story is with Monarda didyma. This is the scarlet bee balm. There's some idea that it might actually be native, but it probably was never common. Others think that it has just always been a garden escapee, but I really love Monarda fistulosa. I would highly recommend that one. I have it in my yard, and it's just like grows like in profusion. And that's kind of another thing that I didn't say explicitly, but I sort of always think if we're going to put all this effort into growing native plants, we should grow ones that are going to do well. And rare plants are not going to do well, like a lot of them. So, you know, you can get some of them going, and it depends on the one. But Monarda fistulosa is going to do well. It's like this tall in my yard, beautiful, like buzzing with so many pollinators. So that's the Monarda to grow, I think. The rare one, the one that's definitely rare in Vermont is Monarda punctata. So that would be one to avoid. But that one's common in the prairies of the Midwest.
So are people okay with the ones that I brought, or would it be better to just politely put those back on the table?
Illustration of how complex this all is. I don't know.
And the fistulosa, that's the bright red scarlet one, right?
Yeah. Or so no, sorry. Didyma's bright red. Fistulosa is purple. It's like pink purple. Yeah, Hayley.
Grace, what would be your advice to people about where to plant the seed packets that we're taking home today?
Oh yeah. So what's the other species?
The other one's the New England aster.
Oh, New England aster. Yeah. That is such a great kind of generalist species. I would put it in the open. So if you have like a shade garden, that's probably not the place to put it. Something that we didn't get into is like site condition. How do you use your site condition to inform what you grow? But New England aster is going to do really well in the sun and is not really picky about soil. I feel like Music, which is like in between wet and dry, is probably best for New England aster.
And Michelle reminded me that they have a seed library here at the library.
Oh, wow.
Most local libraries, I'm finding, are doing that too.
Oh, that's great.
There's a place in West called Shinleaf Natives. I just looked up to see where they get their seeds, and they're collecting them from their land.
Mm-hmm.
And they have a pledge that they never collect seeds from endangered plants growing in the wild. So from plants growing on and near our property. And they have a list. They sell at the Brattleboro Farmers Market in the summer, but their farm is open on the weekends. And she did a bulk planting this winter so I got some hyssop and some Monarda from her as well. But just so if you're not aware, that's
Yeah, I don't know.
Southern Maine.
What's her
resource.
name?
Her name is Isabel, and it's called Shinleaf Native. And she's in
your email list now.
Westminster website. Shinleaf.native.plants@gmail.com.
That's great. Yeah, I think collecting, I think you can really ethically collect from native species. And doing it on private land is a good way to go because there often are permits that you need to get if you're on state or federal land. So if you have a friend with nice stands of Joe Pye weed or whatever, a lot of people are doing that, and then they go back and start founder plots like next to their greenhouse or whatever, and that's just when you start growing out your own like big patch, and then you take seed from that, and that can reduce collection pressure on the wild populations. And I think that's a great strategy.
Yeah, she's got Native Plant Trust and Wild Seed Project as her organizations that she is providing as resources. So I'm like, okay, that feels trustworthy.
That sounds great. Yeah.
Thank you for that share.
That's good. Yeah. Yeah.
Are you available for like on-site consulting?
Yeah. Yeah. It's your taxpayer dollars at work. I love to get onto private land. A lot of people, well, we don't do a lot of surveys on private lands. I'm also happy to give like recommendations on, what do I think would do well here. But we also are just really interested in inventorying private lands. If you have land with intact natural communities, our surveys are really skewed towards conserved lands because we just don't have the staff to be doing landowner outreach and getting landowner permissions. It can be time intensive and not everybody wants the state on their land.
Well, if you're going to come and help us pick plants, then you'd certainly be welcome to
Thanks.
survey
Yeah, I
everything.
appreciate that. But yeah, I'm available by email. I do a lot of like, people send me lists, I review them. Even if you send me a description or a photo of where you want to plant. And I'm not an expert on the actual growing or horticulture or anything, but I can tell you about your site conditions and give some recommendations. Yeah.
I'm a little confused when you talked about the locally rare species. Is this something somebody's going to advertise? That they have a rare species?
No, that's the thing.
So
They
I'll get
probably
this,
won't.
I'll get the name, and then if I look it up, that's
Yeah.
how I'll know. Okay,
Yeah,
all right.
right. And that's kind of why I was talking about like how this really is an ask of you. It's sort of like the burden is on you right now, and I wish that it wasn't that way. I wish that it was advertised like Great St. John's wort. This, if you're in New England, like we don't advise you to grow this. And actually, Wild Seed Project, I reached out to them and I said, hey, we have this problem that we really want to like start setting an example with nurseries that they don't ship seeds of priority species to areas where they're imperiled. And they said, oh yeah, that makes sense. Well, we're not going to allow shipment of sundial lupin to Vermont anymore, or New Hampshire, because we both have we have one remaining population, New Hampshire has two. I was so impressed with that because I think it's just like the beginning. They're a small company, but it is the beginning of setting that bar of responsibility on their end. And then people see that on the website and they start to think like, oh, why? I thought it was great to grow Lupinus perennis in Vermont. Why not? And then we explain like the real genetic risk to this population. Yeah. Questions for
So,
Hayley?
With this lupin, is the native population of lupin available for replanting, or is that considered a rare endangered species that we shouldn't mess with?
It's state endangered,
Yeah.
and it's just the one population that we have left. So we formerly had 9 populations of sundial lupin. This is one that is so common in conservation mixes, and if you're like, I've never heard of this, don't worry, because not a lot of people have, but we're really trying to get the word out. It's a sandplain species. It's fire adapted. We lost all 8 populations to fragmentation and development in Colchester and Essex. So we are actually next week, Native Plant Trust is starting seeds for us. The seeds were collected from the 1 population in 1992. Luckily, these seeds last for decades and they're in storage. So lupin seeds have an impermeable seed coat that has to be like nicked with a razor, and then you induce germination. So they should hold up. I'm really hoping, because we only have 800 seeds in the seed bank and 6 plants at the site. It's really concerning. But what we hope to do is I'm gonna have them grow out plants, and then we're gonna reintroduce them to a site that it's a different site, but it's within the historic range. So we're hoping to reestablish a population.
So Grace, when I see the lupins like at the resort,
Different
those
species.
should not be there. Is
Different
that what-
species. Those are actually, they're native to the Pacific Northwest.
Which is why they're so gorgeous, okay.
They're gorgeous. Miss Rumphius, that book, she was spreading a non-native plant, sorry, Miss Rumphius. She thought she was doing a good thing, but.
So really, it's beyond the landscapers, it goes back to the large property owners with the showy gardens too, doesn't it? Like that, I mean, I'm just trying to get to the bottom of how to, okay.
Well,
Got you.
right, one day back in the past, somebody planted Lupinus polyphyllus, this is the non-native species, in their garden, probably thinking, oh, it'll just be here. It's everywhere now, and unfortunately it hybridizes with our native species. So that's a whole other story. Like, what do we do if the genetics get compromised in that way? Then do we conserve the hybrid? You know, we haven't gotten
Right,
to that.
it's a quandary.
It's very, very
Okay.
complicated, yeah. Nobody has really looked into that actually, to see whether there's active hybridization in New England, but it's possible. So that's another concern about the non-native one. Yeah.
I was just looking at those, a lot of those are like small, sort of grassy plants, except the flowerwood and the tea. What sort of keystone shrub species, if you had to pick 5 to recommend to people to plant, what would you recommend?
Yeah, it depends on your site. We have a lot of great wetland shrubs that Hayley named. There are probably a bunch of good ones there. Dogwood, I would say. Probably would do well in like mesic soils too, not just super wet. One of my personal favorites is spicebush. It's really showy, and it's a little bit more of a southern species, so maybe it will do well with climate change. It's kind of restricted to the warmer parts of Vermont. Viburnums. What were the viburnums that we showed?
I didn't mention any viburnums, but let's see, wild raisin I think is one that gets recommended a lot.
Yeah.
And also there's, I always forget if it's Viburnum opulus or edulus, but there's this one that has both a European and
opulus.
native one that maybe you could give like a disclaimer that now is not a good time to buy that one.
I would just avoid opulus all around. It's the source of a lot of confusion. And the characters that distinguish the European subspecies and the native one are cryptic at best.
Mountain laurel.
Isn't that?
Mountain laurel?
Yeah,
Oh, yeah.
yeah, right?
It's slow
Yours-
growing or hard to propagate, but I love mountain laurel. Definitely more warmer climate. If you're in southern Vermont, we used to track it as uncommon, but we don't anymore. What else for sure?
I would just add that there is now a native, I think it's called the Riparian Lands Native Seed Partnership, based in the Intervale Conservation Nursery in Burlington and also the Northwood Stewardship Center. And they're doing a lot of work on collecting local ecotypes of woody and shrubby species that are important for restoration. In their founding, their staff was located in northern Vermont, so they were taking seeds from northern Vermont. But this summer, they're going to come camp out at my house for a while, collect some southern Vermont ecotypes, and they are a really good resource if you're looking into more of those like trees and shrubs.
Fletcher Memorial team is working with them on a couple of partnership sites down in Ludlow,
Awesome.
hopefully in Cavendish, and hopefully maybe we can connect up if they're coming to visit.
Yeah,
If I can buy them pizza or something, they'll come visit one of our sites and check it out.
I'm sure.
Can you repeat the name of that?
Well, the problem is I don't quite know the name. I can send it to Kelly. It's something like do you know the official name, Kelly?
I know Intervale and Northwood Stewardship Center and Hannah Dallas County Forester and a couple of other partners, Brad, we're working on basically a native shrub and tree sourcing network. I think the name might still be sort of in flux.
I think it's akin to Riparian Lands Native Seed Partnership.
So,
gardening's new to me, and native plants have been reading about, and I'm here because I felt like I totally failed, and you confirmed it. I have a lot of plants that I just from researching saying, how do I know what cultivar I have? What do I have?
Yeah.
And I'm guessing I don't have. So what's the recommendation? I have a field that I've tried to create, but I'm guessing I have the wrong lupins and the wrong Monara and things like that.
So what I'll say about if you have rare plants in your garden, let's think about the lupin. Do you live around here?
Yes.
Yeah. So here we are really far away from our native lupin population, which is in Colchester. The likelihood of your lupin interbreeding with the native population is very low. And I'm not interested in like policing people's gardens, and I actually don't think that it's worth ripping your lupin out. If you were in Colchester, it might be a different story because there's just more likelihood of exchange there and of impact to the genetics of that population. And we just know that species is really vulnerable to genetic inbreeding. But it's totally dependent on where you are. So yeah, I don't think that's a priority for you to pull that plant out. It's very unlikely that it's gonna have a negative effect. And part of this is it's hard to say that without confusing like the general public, because the messaging gets muddied and then people are like, oh, wait, so actually it's okay if I grow endangered plants? And I've found that just for simplicity of messaging, I kind of have to say, like, look at the state ranking. But when it comes down to it, there is the nuance of a buffer around a population. Like, we really don't want people growing that plant in that buffer. What that buffer is, I have no idea because nobody's ever written about that. And so we kind of draw these arbitrary lines. We just say, if you're in Vermont, don't grow it. If you're in New Hampshire, don't grow it. And then suddenly you cross the border into Massachusetts and it's not listed and you can grow it. So I acknowledge that those like political boundaries are arbitrary, and you're not like doing an evil thing, don't feel guilty, but it just depends on the species.
Well, you hope to have a pollinating garden, but if you're providing the wrong...
Well, that's a hard
It's
one
like giving
too.
them, what do they say, like processed food to the bees where they really need the whole food. And
Well, that's
isn't that
tricky,
kind
too.
of what we're doing?
And that gets back to like, what do you value? And so if you really value feeding the bumblebees, like you're probably doing that honestly with your sundial lupin that you're growing. Even if it's a non-local ecotype, I'm sure that pollinators are still coming to that plant.
Yes.
So it's all about weighing your values there. And isn't that the case with everything? Like, okay, you're in Colchester, you're growing a lupin, and yes, you're like feeding a bumblebee, but is that really worth risking the genetic integrity of our like natural heritage? I would say no, but my values are different from a lot of people who are like hardcore horticulturalists at the risk of like being divisive. Because I think that actually part of what my like call to action here is that we need more overlap between the world of horticulture and the world of ecology. I just see those like so siloed. And that's one reason why we're in this situation where people are like, I have never heard of this. Nobody has ever told me not to grow regionally rare species. It's like, yeah, it's not part of the conversation. And I want to say, like, I don't mean to call out American Meadows when I showed you that list. I called them up and I said, hey, here's the situation. Can you please take sundial lupin off your northeast mix? And they said, yeah. They're like really open to changing. And I was so happy because they're a pretty big company, and that I think would be huge. So I just want to acknowledge that they are trying and they're trying to do the right thing. But that's the kind of shift that I think we need. We need to like have those worlds come together a little bit more, so that people aren't blindsided like by this after they've already put all this effort into planting their whole garden out. Did you have a comment?
I wanted to add also, part of the pressure is in deciding what you plant in your own garden, but part of the solution is also in what parts of your yard you're not planting and you're not managing. So if you do have the opportunity to leave parts of your yard messy and to let things regrow, you know, maybe you didn't plant every single step in the season of the pollinator food chain, but you know, hopefully you left those like empty stems for them to live in, and some native plants are popping up in the places that you used to mow and now you don't, and you've got your bare soil that the bees are nesting in. So it's, we don't save the world by controlling every aspect of it. Sometimes what we have to do is like leave certain parts without our control.
That's a great point. This, I didn't really tell the story of this, but this is little blue stem, one of my favorite native grasses, and one that I really push for when I talk about, like, what should I grow that's going to make a difference. This was an area in Colchester that was burned, and then a seed mix was put down with little blue stem and some other native grasses, and then this plant popped up. The manager, this is state land, and the manager was like, I don't know where that came from. And I went on site and I was like, oh my God, did you plant this? Does anybody know this plant? This is a bush clover, Lespedeza capitata, round-headed bush clover. It's sort of an uncommon, it's not listed as rare, but it's uncommon in Vermont because it's really a sand plain species. But this was probably in the seed bank, and what we see in sand plains is that the seed bank will last like 100 years, and if you just scarify it and expose a little soil, you'll have all of these like great native plants coming up. And we actually had a really rare sedge at this site, Carex rinaldii, come up after the burn too, and it's doing great. So yeah, I think just like, that's part of the fun of it, is seeing what will come up when you remove the non-natives.
Let me see any questions in the chat. I did have one request for the aster seeds in East Wallingford, so
Okay.
shipping those out.
Thanks, Kelly. Any other river questions for Hayley? Should we wrap up?
Hayley, where are some good spots to paddle in the maple fern swamp? Or not the swamp, but the
the
maple
floodplain.
fern.
Most of the paddling I've actually done so far has been in northern Vermont, because I did grad school at UVM. But if you go to vermontriverconservancy.org, there's a tab called Find Your River, and it shows a map of all of the paddling put-ins and camping spots and hiking spots that we've conserved down here in this neck of the woods. Yeah, good question.
Yeah, the Winooski is really, I've mostly paddled around there too, but the Winooski and the Platte, the floodplain forests are just so majestic, especially in
is it like
spring.
good flat water for those of us who do not?
Yeah.
My husband's a whitewater paddler.
No, I'm not into that. And easy access
Good,
to
nice.
their boat ramps. Thank you all so much for coming out on a Saturday.
I wanted to thank everybody too, and thank you guys for, I really appreciated the non-lectury aspect of it, that it was literally a journey through the landscape to see things from, a bug's point of view and the plant's point of view and history's point of view. I really appreciated that. It was refreshing. So looking forward to having you guys come down and do some site walks with us and be a big part of the conversation as we plant some small and large little floodplain areas. So looking forward to that. If anyone's interested in that, in the Plymouth or Ludlow or Cavendish or even Springfield, if you're from Springfield, stay in touch with me too.